Welcome to the second in a series of interviews with candidates to replace Representative Niki Tsongas in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm Peggy Wargelin, a member of Concord Citizens Protecting Progress. Today we welcome Alexandra Chandler, former intelligence analyst with the Office of Naval Intelligence. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Thank you for having me, Peggy.
Okay. Most of the questions will be about your knowledge and philosophy of government, as well as your strategies for making decisions. We'll end with a lightning round, asking you to quickly comment about other issues important to our members. Let's start with a 2-minute biography. What would you like voters to know about you?
Okay, so as Peggy mentioned, I was formerly with the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the way that I came to do intelligence work, which I did for 13 years, was I was in law school, so I'm also a former lawyer, in New York City during the 9/11 attacks on September 11th, 2001. And my then girlfriend, and we're in a high school, she was my high school sweetheart. She was in a subway train under Lower Manhattan when the towers came down. And I felt, I had a few hours not knowing if she had made it. And in those hours, I will not be ashamed to say, I screamed, I cried, I begged. It was also the 7th anniversary of the day I lost my birth father, who had struggled with MS and addiction. So that day changed the course of my life because she called me a few hours later from a payphone, because there were payphones, and said that she was okay. I then decided to join the intelligence community. I was a Russian speaker. I'd studied Russian foreign policy at Brown under Professor Sergei Khrushchev, as in son of Nikita. And I knew where countries that end with stan are located, which at the time was a valuable thing. And I joined the intelligence community. I spent 13 years there working on weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, and counterterrorism, stopping countries like North Korea from exporting such things, and stopping weapons going to terrorist groups. And that was my career. And along the way, as this is a biography, Kathy and I got married, and we had 2 adorable children, a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, William and George. And also along the way, and I think we'll talk about this in some more depth, possibly weaved into the other questions, I also had a gender transition while I was on the job at the Office of Naval Intelligence in 2006, when it was legal to fire me on the spot. So there's a story there, and we'll get to it. But that's a lot of my life in a nutshell. And it's been a wonderful life, and it's, even with its challenges, it's just made me optimistic and grateful, and that's part of what I want to offer up into this race.
Okay, thank you. The first group of questions asks about your opinions about the federal government. What types of programs should the federal government be responsible for?
Well, there's obviously the core constitutional programs that the framers of the Constitution saw as vital, the national defense, that sort of thing, the basics of raising money and taxes to support the judiciary, etc. But in a modern society, I do believe that our federal government should be the guarantor of certain, not only the basic rights of all of our citizens and even people who are here that are not citizens, but as well as the ability for people to have a life where they can have opportunity, dignity, and security. So in practical terms, I believe that would include such things as universal health care. I do believe that the federal government should, through its taxation power and then as an expenditure, fund a single-payer healthcare system to support that very basic need for all people, because forget about just the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence speaks of the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And both the life part and the pursuit of happiness part surely involves the right to very basic healthcare, the fundamental. So that, and then I would say guarantor to the right of a free and appropriate education for all people, which, again, to my mind, in partnership with state and local governments, that includes making sure that regardless of the town or the city that you happen to live in, that you have a quality education that unlocks your full potential. But that then, as you get older, to my mind, that should also involve the right to attend an institution of higher learning or advanced education, technical education, that is at the very least without debt and, I would prefer, no cost. within the confines of a state school. So these are some of the examples. There's more. But then I would also say that the federal government, and this is all in partnership with state and local, this involves maintaining infrastructure to enable interstate commerce, which surely our federal government has fallen way behind on. That's something that I would see as a priority for us. And then I would also say, because we do have a capitalist system, and I do believe in that system, however, it cannot thrive properly without appropriate regulation, and where the market has not corrected itself in ways to ensure that prosperity is broadly shared throughout the society, the federal government can use the tax code and other means to ensure that income inequality does not explode out of control. So I would see things like an expanded earned income tax credit and other means to ensure that prosperity that our capitalist system does create is broadly shared by all people. So some examples.
Thank you. All right. Describe one program run by the federal government you feel is especially successful and effective, and explain why you think that is so.
Especially effective. Well, I mean, goodness knows where to start. I would say the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control. Think about, and this goes to some of my own biography that we didn't get to, think of HIV/AIDS. Think of where we were as a country. Some of my, not quite early memories. I'm 41 years old, so but I can remember in middle school and around that time just how terrified we were as a society as to where the epidemic was going. And then as an adult, because when I was living in DC and part of the intelligence community, I was also on the board of the Whitman Walker Health Center, which is an LGBT health clinic in DC with a specialty in HIV/AIDS care. And where we were in the 80s compared to where we are now, where this is a chronic condition, a serious one, and we have to keep it in control. This is largely because of NIH and CDC partnerships with research centers around the country and around the world that developed AZT and other things to control the epidemic. So that's something where the federal government, as a prime mover and actor in a space, can really not only improve the quality of life of millions, but save the life of millions. And I'd say another example, which doesn't quite go to the visceral kind of day in and day out life and death of people, but something where the federal government has uniquely done something, space program, NASA. And that's also a bit of biography. I am an unrepentant astronomy geek. My father gave me a Schmidt-Newtonian telescope when I was 10 years old, and I hauled that thing around to basement apartments and dorms and other places, and I share that love with my now 6-year-old son.
Nice. Now describe a federal program you feel is not successful. What improvements would you suggest?
Not successful. Well, it's sad when you have to sort of pick on something, but I'd say certain of our agricultural programs, our certain subsidy programs, where what we are doing is making life more difficult for some of our small, like genuinely small farmers and family farmers by overly subsidizing agribusiness, which, let's be frank, this concentrates in certain politically important states, which electorally Massachusetts sadly has not been for quite some time in presidential elections, that sort of thing, which puts some of our producers at disadvantage and costs a great deal of money and increases prices for the consumer. So I'd say some of those subsidies are not so advisable. And as I've been speaking about that, I would say that the far greater problem would actually be a good deal of our subsidies towards the exploration of fossil fuels, which, however well-intentioned decades ago, when we had no alternatives and we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union and we were looking at this in terms of a national security argument, why we always had to have fuel in a petroleum reserve, that sort of thing, we're past that. And we should turn all of those off and redirect either towards the pockets of the working and middle class of the country or into renewables and forge a path to energy independence, which then also could create an economic boom, which frankly, this Commonwealth and this district is well positioned to take advantage of, given the kind of manufacturers we have here, the education of our workforce.
Cool. All right. What improvements would you suggest? I think you've kind of covered that, but if you feel like there's something concrete.
Okay. Well, we can go further with this. I would say is that I was just talking about kind of renewable energy and green energy. What I would also say is this links with something else that I mentioned earlier, which is infrastructure, where when there's a lot of talk in politics these days about a big infrastructure program, and that would be a wonderful thing in and of its own right if we had, say, a rail line in parallel with 495 or the light rail or bus rapid transit, something to relieve the pressure. If we could transform the commuter rail into a regional rail system with trains operating, that's very well and good, and we should do those things. But what else we can do is we can use the leverage of federal infrastructure dollars to do things that are like retrofitting schools, retrofitting our public utilities, and tie in with it climate resiliency and energy independence, so that then when you say are rebuilding the school in a certain town, or you are renovating the sewer plant or these other bits of infrastructure, that then when you're doing everything from the roof that you put on a building to the landscaping around it to everything, that you're building in 500-year climate resiliency, so that then you're not only improving the built environment and the quality of life and reliability of transportation, all of that for people, but you're also helping us save this planet. That's the kind of thing where you can bring together multiple goals simultaneously, to my mind.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Let's see. When is it appropriate to make use of private sector resources, like outsourcing and public-private partnerships for government functions?
It's all but a last resort, to my mind. It's often too easily grabbed when people or politicians are wary about seeking the revenue for a line item, when, frankly, there can be an element of lack of political will or even political cowardice in some cases. I would say that at the federal level, because that's running for Congress, that's where I'm really looking to, we have so starved the federal government for revenue for so long in terms of the wealthiest in this country. Since roughly 1982 and the first round of the Reagan tax cuts, we have accepted as a reality that if the wealthiest in this country are paying more than, say, 39.6%, that they are going to be put in a horrible, desperate position when this is not so. The infrastructure needs, the healthcare needs, the education needs of a thriving middle class, the kind of middle class that we built in the post-World War II boom, the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was built on a system of progressive taxation, strong unions. That is how you build a strong middle class. In that system, you didn't need public-private partnerships to do things like build the interstate highway system. We just built it. You didn't need private-public partnerships to get us to the moon. We just did it. We have accepted a lesser outcome because we don't want to do the politically difficult things, but it's actually sitting right there in front of us as the obvious thing to do, which is the federal government needs revenue to create a society that Americans want. If you poll Americans overwhelmingly and say, do you want more infrastructure? Do you want this? Do you want this? Yes, 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 yes. And you ask Americans, what do you think the taxation system is and what should it look like? And if you show them different pie charts, they always vote for the one that looks like the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And the one that we have now, they either can't believe that that possibly exists, and if it does, they don't want it.
All right. What federal government programs have you or members of your extended family benefited from?
Department of Education student loans. That's absolutely certain. The federal direct student loan program, federal consolidation loans, because I went to undergraduate education at the University of Pennsylvania, transferred after a year, and then to Brown University, and then to law school at Brooklyn Law. None of these are inexpensive institutions. And I was a work-study student, so I also benefited from those programs under DOE. I was a cashier in the Brown University dining halls. I was a very friendly cashier, and very good with the scooping of the food and all of that. I've benefited very directly. It was part of how I got the education that has enabled me to thrive professionally. And then what I would also say is housing and urban development. The loan on the house that my wife and I, when we were living in DC, we had to, and this is the experience of so many millennials and Gen X, we had to put off buying a house for a very long time between student loans, between the fact that I'm transgender and I had to pay for tens of thousands of dollars of my own health care, and we had to stretch and scrimp and save. We were just barely able to buy a house the very year that we had our first child. And we couldn't have done that without the Department of Housing and Urban Development and a FHA loan. So I am very much conscious of what the federal government has done to enable opportunity for me, which goes back to my comment at the beginning, because I am self-aware that where I have myself gotten to in life is very much because of the federal government serving as that guarantor of opportunity, dignity, and security, and the promises of the pursuit of happiness. And I would not deny that to any other. I would, if anything, try to magnify and elevate that role for others.
The next set of questions is about how you obtain and use information.
Sure.
What is a fact to you, and how are facts important in your decision making?
A fact is something that can be proven by hopefully scientific means, if not other analytical methods, to be true in an objective, non-subjective sense. Okay. And then the second part of the question is, how do I use facts?
Yes, how do you use them in your decision making?
In a very disciplined manner, because this question is fascinating to me on more levels than you might know, because I was in the intelligence community. So we have a particular aversion in the intel world to declaring things, pieces of information, as facts unless the proof is unassailable. Because until proven otherwise, all facts could be considered suspect. We want to be very certain of how we separate fact from assessment, even as we call it, very high confidence assessment. So I approach the separation of facts and the separation from that and assumptions and assessments with a great deal of care. It can, in my decision making and in my speech, it could sometimes be confused for hesitation, but it really isn't. It's really much more of I want to take care and be sure, because I come from a professional culture where when I joined the intelligence community, it was right after the Iraq WMD failings. So from orientation day one, thou shalt not allow intelligence to be politicized, thou shalt approach all things with analytic rigor, thou shalt take care to separate facts from analysis, know the difference. So I will bring that to my processes when I approach politics, when I approach considering whether a bill or a proposal is beneficial or not for the citizens. I will question, and then question some more. There's also probably some of my legal training at play in all of this, I think.
Okay. Do you verify information provided to you? Sounds like you do.
Yes,
but
I'm sorry, I skipped
but that's all right.
one.
And then
Yes.
How do you decide what sources of information to trust?
Well, you go to some extent to track record. And then this could sound worse than it is, experimentation, where you see, all right, I'm looking at this news story, or I'm looking at this item, and now let me play this out. So I believe that, okay, so just the other day, a report came out in the Daily Beast that Senator Claire McCaskill was hacked by elements of Russian intelligence. And I, as a candidate and an interested citizen, had to make a judgment. Well, do I consider this to be a source that I can trust? And what I did was, I looked through the story with the lens of a former intelligence analyst, and then I'm looking at other coverage, and then I'm also looking at indictments that Mueller had put together previously, and I'm saying, okay, so let me go through the storyline and let me see if their assessment is holding up based on what I see from other reporting. And when it did, then I said, all right, I can consider that at the very least a source that I can have a reasonable level of confidence in, if not high confidence. And what I do is, I mentioned track record at the outset, track record and diversity, because even if there are sources that I find that I'm going to a lot because they have a strong track record, that in and of itself can cause a problem, because my assessment of what constitutes a strong track record is in and of itself inescapably biased by my own perspective. So what I'll need to do is continually test and see if, well, I've looked at NPR and I've looked at the BBC on this, but really I do also want to have Al Jazeera's take and see if that's okay. And then having tested a few times, all right, Al Jazeera, you're coming into the circle of usual trusted sources. So it's a matter of not just what you trust, but then making sure that dynamically that you're then testing even the trusted on occasion and making sure they hold up and that there's diversity within that source set. And always, always, always try to have something that's way outside looking in. I named Al Jazeera, for instance, for a reason, because it's actually one of my most trusted, because a very, very outside lens in some cases looking in can be among the most valuable, because they might see trends that you might miss if you're too close.
Okay.
BBC and NPR out there too.
How do you communicate with people who trust different information sources than you do?
With empathy, because as I just mentioned, we all have our biases. We all do. And much as I have developed this inner schema of a series of metrics that I think should be met for something to be trusted, though I do believe there is, in many cases, objective truth, I also know that my analysis is far from unassailable. So what I will do is presume, until proven otherwise, that the person opposite me with their series of different sources has also constructed it with internally logically consistent analysis. Until proven otherwise. And sometimes it does get proven otherwise. Yeah. But knowing that at the outset, I'm not going to, if I'm going to stack my sources up against your sources, we're going to just bang into each other at first. So sometimes what you can do is seek the helpful arbitration of a third-party source that we both agree on. And that's something that's come in handy both in my current political campaigning going about and back in my previous professional world. Sometimes if you are engaged in dialogue across government or with other governments that you have to deal with, sometimes instead of just, well, the United States this, well, country X this, well, we have this from country Y that we've also been allowed to share with you. Oh, okay.
All right. Let's move on to the specific elected position you're running for. Why do you want to be the U.S. Representative for Massachusetts District 3?
Because in modesty, I think I'm the best candidate to get things done in Congress for ordinary people. And the reason for that goes to some of what we were just talking about in terms of my ability to connect with people across divides. I mentioned the kind of work that I was doing, which is weapons of mass destruction, proliferation analysis, dealing with problems like North Korea and Iran, Russia, and exports of munitions to conflict zones like Syria, like Yemen. And these kind of problems are so difficult. And yet, what I did for 12 of 13 years that I was working on these issues, I had to work with people, forget about other Democrats or other like-minded politicians within this district or the state. I had to work under the Bush administration, under the Obama administration, briefly under the Trump administration, with people not at all like me, incredibly conservative people, some of them, people from all over the country, people, because I mentioned the whole being transgender bit, who did not believe in my basic humanity in some cases when we're dealing with foreign governments, because I also didn't deal with just foreign governments of similar values. And I was effective. The Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, he gave my unit the highest non-combat award that an analytic unit can get for performance. And that effectiveness, I believe I can translate to Congress, where in a world, intelligence, which is all about not just analysis that gets talked about a lot, but relationships. I can forge relationships. But then combined with that, I have lived experience where I'm someone, I spoke of my experience in community health care. I have the expertise in national security. Being a Russian-speaking lawyer with experience in North Korea and Iran, I think is valuable right now. Someone who's written for the Presidential Daily Brief and reviewed for it. But I'm also a middle-class mom with a son in a public school. I have been the parent of a child in a Title I school in DC. My son's school had a shooting incident across the street from the school. I have gotten that nightmare phone call. Thank God every one of the students and staff were okay. I have been through that. I have the student loans. I have the daycare costs. I have the concerns of ordinary people. I mentioned my father, his struggle with addiction. So you take that, combined with my expertise, combined with my ability to work across divisions, and that's what led me to decide to get into this race. Not with any, reverse this, I didn't leap into it in that Representative Tsongas announced her retirement last August. I did not announce my run until November. I had to be convinced. Everything that I've just said to you, I had to really get to that point. But having gotten to that point, I am now utterly convinced of it. And that is why I'm in.
All right. How long have you lived in the district?
Well, so I was just, as I mentioned, in the intelligence community. We moved over the course of last summer because when Donald Trump was elected, we had, after that point in that spring, had decided that 13 years of WMD and terrorism, and the fact that my parents live in Haverhill, my brother is in Attleboro, my wife's mom grew up in Medford, and my wife has 40 first cousins.
Whoa.
In Massachusetts.
Okay.
And we had no family down there.
Mm-hmm.
So we had decided to move for family and sell our house and all of that. So we moved over the course of last summer, and I left the job. So it would be roughly a year, because again, before that, intelligence.
Yep. All right, you may have answered some of these, but I'll do all the
Please.
questions. This is a very diverse district. How do you plan to represent the interests of people with such varying concerns and views of what government can and should do?
I have done a lot of listening, much more than talking, over the course of this almost 9 months in this campaign. And that is part of it. And the experience, again, from the intelligence side of the empathize, relationships, and to me, that also involves ongoing consultation. I talked about having to check biases. I consider myself a progressive, a liberal, but I'm also someone who, when people hear about my biography, I've had people assume that I'm a conservative Republican.
Okay.
So I'm someone who understands that this district has a lot of different viewpoints, and that sometimes it can be in unpredictable clusters, so to speak. You can have people who want very activist government in some ways, but then not at all in others. And you can have people who are across the board, get the government out of everything, and then move the government into everything. So I will take all that information in. I have my own point of view, and I'm running on a very comprehensive, detailed platform that I wrote myself that we put out January or February. Okay. So having gone out so early, I can't flip-flop or anything because I put it all out there. But what I can certainly do and will always do is refine on the basis of the ongoing feedback that I get. And I've seen this district. I've talked with thousands of people. I've been to the farms. I've been to the inner cities. I've been to the recovering mill towns. I've been to the not recovering mill towns. I've been to everything in between. And I get that, in a sense, this district is a microcosm of the United States. And that is both a humbling and a beautiful thing, in a sense, that we do have to reach across all those divides. But given my biography that I've explained, it's something that I think I'm actually all the more uniquely suited to, rather than being a strict partisan and advocate for one cluster of people. It's all of us.
All right. Let's see. What concerns do you hear about from voters most often? What are the issues you're most concerned about personally?
Well, there's the general dissatisfaction with politics and a general sense of loss and anxiety about the direction of the country, about the state of democracy, period, and of government, period, at the federal level in particular. And that's where I try to satisfy a certain hunger, where I can offer not what, in my opinion, Donald Trump offered, which was more of let's just disrupt everything by kind of throwing a bomb into the whole process. I offer more of a positive disruption, where I'm someone who has worked in Washington for 13 years across these divisions, and where intelligence intersects not just with trying to stop WMD or terrorism, but when you're dealing with these countries, we're simultaneously dealing with things like trade policy or human rights. I've been at the table where it's, yeah, sorry, we know that you've got the intel on WMD on this thing, but the president is going to be speaking with them about our policy on X, Y, and Z. So I have to see how those mesh together. So I can talk to voters about that. They respond positively at that mix of positive disruption and experience, but then to issues as opposed to kind of this generalized anxiety and frustration. The opioid epidemic is a very big one that transcends a lot of boundaries, where we talked about the diversity of the district. That there are very few places where you don't talk to someone who's been touched by the epidemic in some way. And then that's where I talk about a public health approach, building on my experience with an HIV/AIDS-centric clinic. We actually, when I joined the clinic, they were a payroll or two away from turning off the lights because it was the 2008 financial crisis. Yes. We had 12,000 patients depending on us. By the time I was done, we had 16,000 patients, and we were in better condition. So I'm able to speak to that well. And then healthcare, because it's not, thank goodness, for a lot of people in the district, it's not about access because of mass health and because of other reforms that we've had here, but the cost and prescription drugs. We're undertaking all of this informal rationing, where people have healthcare in theory, but do they really? And speaking to that directly and saying, yes, I know, because of the healthcare experience that I've had, not just in a community health center, but I have been without health insurance. When I finished law school and I was interviewing with intelligence agencies, I actually gave my first interview, a phone interview, the Office of Naval Intelligence, lying on the floor, because I had a herniated L4, L5 disc that had gone bad again and couldn't afford physical therapy, couldn't afford anything other than just lots of ibuprofen because aforementioned student loans, and I was waiting for a job. So I've been there. And when I can talk to people about that, they get that I will really bring the concern and not forget about it.
Sure. All right. Please tell us about how you are financing your campaign.
Small dollar donations primarily. This last fundraising quarter, and by just a strange coincidence how it's lined up mathematically, over the course of the campaign, over 1,100 donations. Our median is a number many will recognize, $27, which again, over 1,100 contributions, we couldn't possibly plan it. But so a lot of that, something like 22% of our donations are actually under $10. And then of course we have much fewer people who have given more. But no corporate PAC money, no large donations from any kind of developers or fossil fuel associated people. I have no links to any special interest groups of any kind. And it's part of what I like to say that I offer to the voters, that in this race, where there are a great deal of candidates of wonderful qualifications, that what I can say is I will have been propelled there in terms of the contributions by you and only you. And we're all tainted when it comes to money in politics. I don't stand apart from that, but at least in my case, it is I'm tainted by the support of the very voters that I'm trying to get to send me there. And that in human psychology, once I'm in, it will be so much easier for me to actually follow through and do the things that I say that I'm going to do. Because, sadly, you look at paid family leave, you look at raising the federal minimum wage, you look at capping child care costs, all these things that are in my platform and are in some of my competitors' platforms. But there are powerful lobbies opposed to all of those things, whereas those powerful lobbies will have nothing on me because none of them participated in sending me there. And I have signed something called the Candidate with a Contract Initiative, which is a pledge that within 365 days of me going to Congress, if elected, I will introduce legislation to overturn Citizens United, promote publicly funded elections, and a host of other measures on pain of resignation from Congress. I called on all the other candidates in the race to join me in this. Sadly, none of them have. To be fair, all of them, I believe, have committed in some way or another to doing those things, but I have signed that pledge.
All right. Let's see. I'm sorry about this.
Oh, no, don't be.
Oh, what are your criteria for accepting or declining contributions?
Well, I would say whether the person or entity in question is contributing to any negative impact upon society at large, or even individuals in a discrete sense that I can possibly identify. I mean, for instance, we talked about fossil fuels, where if I'm getting suddenly a large donation from a fossil fuel executive, I don't want that. I don't want that. I don't need that. I don't want that. I don't want to even have the perception of being beholden to someone who is not generating a social good. It's not that people that give to me have to all be engaged in heroic endeavors. Far from it. Just that they're not hurting society in some way. And then I would also put in that realm not just actual damage, say, to the climate of the planet, but if someone has just political views that I couldn't possibly be associated with, that would also be the case.
Okay. National politics is increasingly marked by rancor and division, and dealing with this will be a large part of the job. Describe a past situation where you had to work to get something done with a group of people who strongly disagreed with your position.
All right. I talked about transitioning on the job under the Bush administration in 2006. The culmination of the difficulty with that is having come out to my chain of command, my immediate team. When it got out to the broader workforce, there was a town hall about a new pay system that we were all going to be under. And someone raised their hand at the kind of open question period and decided to bring me up as an issue. I was going to transition just in the coming days. I was in my cube seeing this on closed circuit TV and said that there's this drag queen who's going to be using the bathrooms and this is disgusting, and the captain had to protect them. Half the audience applauded. An auditorium full of people, so hundreds. And the captain said some wonderful things, and then the other half of the audience applauded. But where the getting things done with people that you disagree with comes in is, I showed up to work the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, for 11 years. And I rose into management as a division chief managing the activities of dozens of analysts. And in that role and others, I had to work with many of the people in that auditorium who had cheered at the thought that I should be fired summarily for being who I was. I had to walk by them in the hallways. I had to sit across conference tables. I had to decide whether they get awards or go on travel because I'm a member of the management team and we're looking at the budget. I had to do all that. And the way that I did it was to compartmentalize that moment, that experience with a certain lack of education, lack of experience, because many of them had never come across someone like me, and to simply turn on that analytic brain that we have been talking about previously and view it in those terms. And that has served me well when it was my own very livelihood and status as a person. I believe that would serve me well in Congress, where the divisions are so dramatic. And I think that it's actually part of the uniqueness of what I offer, in that I'm someone who has had to claw her way to even that basic level of respect, that I'm someone who can both be very tough, but also very, I keep using empathy. I have a great deal of empathy even for the people who cheered, because many of them were afraid. And it's understanding that it's fear in many cases. And it's even fear sometimes when it comes to policy. When you're saying, say, let's take immigration, and I'm someone who believes that we need to offer a path, permanent citizenship, permanent status and citizenship to anyone who's undocumented in this country who has no conviction for violent crime. I understand that many of the people on the other side of the issue, it's not that they're hateful or that they're awful, but that they're afraid. So deal with the fear. And that's where, again, understanding motivation and understanding that we're not going to just collide against each other on the facts, but understanding the motivation, that's something I can help with, where I can say, I'm a national security professional. I'll do nothing that will hurt the security of this country. I've stopped weapons going to terrorists. Let me ease your mind.
Sure. All right. What is your philosophy on legislative compromise?
Sort of nibbled at this around in different ways. I believe, though I'm relatively new to partisan electoral politics, my analysis and diagnosis is that we on the more progressive liberal side have too often negotiated with ourselves before getting to the table. Too often.
Yes.
I think that what we can do is come to the table with much bolder vision, bolder positions, and then be reasonable once we get to the table. Don't be so reasonable with ourselves before we get there. And I think that therein lies both how we start to reverse terms sometimes called frame drag, where we've accepted a framing of what is reasonable and what is possible politically for so long. We forget that we were just a presidential signature away, and it was just because of one or two articles or something you saw on TV from President Nixon signing into a system of national daycares in this country. That was Nixon, and that was almost 50 years ago. We need to move the frame back towards a more progressive vision for the country. And part of that involves reaching much higher than we have. And so when it comes to legislative compromise, I will do things like say, yes, let's have a budget whereby we guarantee through the federal government a living wage to every person in this country who has a full-time job. We do that through the Earned Income Tax Credit, Ro Khanna's proposal, and it's in the Progressive Caucus's People's Budget. We do that through that and through a federal job guarantee. Let's start with that. And that's a vision that's easy to understand. It helps in terms of getting people invested in wanting to join in on this effort. But then once we get to the table, we'll see what we come to, rather than starting with something a bit more incremental and then getting nothing.
All right. Finally, let's touch quickly on some other issues important to our members.
Certainly.
Please give a quick response to each issue.
Sure.
Women's right to choose.
Unequivocally support.
Healthcare.
Healthcare, A human right, not a commodity, should be a single-payer system.
Civil rights.
Civil rights, core to my, the very fact that I'm even sitting here talking to you is because the United States has been a leader on civil rights. We need to reduce the backslide that's happened, particularly to communities of color and immigrants and others in the last few years.
Net neutrality.
Net neutrality, must restore it. California, no, Washington State has an excellent model of how to do that. We need to try to scale that up to the federal level.
Okay. Gun regulations.
Gun regulations. My son's school had a school shooting incident. I support robust federal regulation to complement Massachusetts' excellent gun laws. So for me, restore the federal assault weapons ban, raise the purchase age to 21, universal background checks, ban large capacity magazines, fund a federal buyback program, and give the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives the ability to not just have paper records, but actual databases, like we used to have when I would track guns abroad in the intelligence community. But we can't do that at home.
The latest round of tax cuts.
Repeal and replace.
Government policy for the situation in Puerto Rico.
A few things we need to do. Both, no more of this large loan guarantees. We need to have grant money into Puerto Rico, which was in a fiscal crisis beforehand, exacerbated by the fact that it is in a quasi-colonial status and has been for far too long. I am one of those who, while respecting the ultimate right of the Puerto Rican people to self-determination, I support statehood for Puerto Rico.
Immigration policy.
Immigration policy requires comprehensive reform, but among the things that we need to do urgently is to stop, even if you're detaining children or families together, that's no solution. So I would use my national security expertise to target defunding of the ERO office, that's enforcement removal operations, under ICE, that undertakes this policy, along with the components of CBP and HHS that are involved. Again, working the federal government, the fastest way to do things, turn off the money. But then a larger reform, undocumented, should have path to citizenship in this country. And that'll frankly save resources for real national security concerns, of which there are many, and it will enhance economic activity in some areas that need it. And it's in accordance with our values. It's who we are.
And finally, campaign finance reform.
Essential to the future of this democracy. We are sliding into oligarchy if we're not careful. And that is why I, again, have signed on with the candidate with a contract pledge, the only one in the race to do so, to undertake sweeping reforms, including completely publicly financed elections. I'm not talking just matching small dollar donations. I mean get money out of politics altogether, because it's not just about the corruption of people that are in the system. It's that we're discouraging wonderful people, all of you out there who should be running and aren't. We need to reform the system so that you will.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us. This was
Thank
great.
you very much for having me.
Once again, thank you for being with us for the interview with Alexandra Chandler, former intelligence analyst with the Office of Naval Intelligence. I'm Peggy Wargelin, a member of Concord Citizens Protecting Progress.